Hello, I'm Dave, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through the best picture settings for HDR gaming on the Panasonic DX750. Okay, so before we begin, one thing that's worth mentioning is that settings are actually shared between SDR and HDR across all picture modes. So any changes you make with HDR content in the settings menu will also carry over to SDR. So the first thing that you're going to want to do ideally is to select a specific picture mode for HDR. In this case, we're going to go with the standard cinema mode. And it's worth mentioning this is the more accurate, or the most accurate kind of out-the-box preset for general viewing, along with a true cinema mode. So it's a good starting point to choose. After that, one of the most important things that you want to do as well is go down to the option settings and make sure that game mode, there it is turned on. So we've already done it, but turning on game mode means you get a low input lag of around 40 milliseconds. It's not as fast as the Samsung, but it still gives you a pretty crisp controller response, and games are still perfectly playable. Okay, so once you've done that, if we go back to the top, we can take a look at some of the other settings available. Now, one of the things that you'll probably notice is that backlight and contrast are automatically ramped up to maximum when using HDR on the Panasonic. You don't have to manually adjust these in game mode like you do on Samsung. This is actually done for you. So backlight and contrast you can actually leave at the default values of 100 when viewing high dynamic range content. The brightness you can also leave at the default value of 0. You usually tend to adjust this if the TV is clipping content in dark areas. In this case, the Panasonic, our model at least, isn't doing that. So it's safe to leave that at 0 and still get all those shadow details. Color and tint, you can also leave these at the default value as well. I actually find that the general color accuracy out of the box is, generally pretty good. Slightly oversaturated, but if you're not getting it calibrated, then I'd advise leaving these as they are. And actually, we did all the calibration using the advanced settings, so we didn't actually have to touch these two settings either. Sharpness, the best thing to do is to turn this down to 0. So by default, it's around 50%, and this introduces sort of edge enhancement across the image. So by turning it down to 0, eliminates those. Some TVs, you do have to sort of set this a few digits above, but on the Panasonic's, 0 is the correct setting. Color temperature, we actually found that warm 2 is the most accurate. And by that I mean it comes closest to hitting the standards for both UHD and standard Blu-rays. In this case it's D65 and basically Rec 2020 color gamut, or Rec 709 for SDR, but that is the setting that comes the closest to matching industry standards. Next couple of settings you want to make sure are turned off. So you've got things like vivid color, Rec 2020 color remaster, adaptive backlight control. Actually, the adaptive backlight control you want to set onto minimum here. So in SDR you can turn it off, but for HDR, in order to get the maximum dynamic range between bright and dark scenes, you want to have this ideally on minimum. The maximum and mid settings aren't very good. They tend to introduce noticeable sort of haloing artifacts as the kind of breaks the backlight up into different columns, which isn't ideal. The minimum is like a global backlight setting, but it's, it dims the display pretty evenly. It's not perfect, but on this particular sort of range of TVs, that's the best setting to use for that. Things like ambient sensor, noise reduction, MPEG remaster and resolution remaster, dynamic range remaster, intelligent frame creation should really be turned off. Some of the settings are automatically grayed out for game mode anyway, so you don't have to worry, but it's best to avoid any unwanted sort of additional processing. The advanced settings menu, this is where you'll find things such as color gamut and custom calibration controls. The color gamut, you want to make sure that's set to Rec 2020 when viewing high dynamic range content. The TV actually does this automatically, but if by chance it doesn't do it, make sure that's ticked, and that will mean that you not only get the wider color gamut, but the TV will also sort of correctly map things like DCI-P3 to Rec 2020. So white balance, I'd suggest leaving this to the default settings if you're not getting the TV calibrated. We actually did calibrate the TV, so here are some of our settings there. Every panel is different, so our settings may not give you a better picture on your particular TV. So you can try these out, but they may not actually give you sort of a better image. So you can leave them back to default, and it does a reasonably good job providing you an accurate image. Same with the color management. Again, we calibrated this ourselves using specialist equipment, but you can leave this at the default values if you're not going to be doing that to your own sort of TV. And the color accuracy out of the box was reasonably good on the Panasonic DX750. Gamma tracking again, we actually felt this could be left at the default position, and it was tracking very evenly across the board, so we didn't have to change that. So you can sort of leave that at 2.2 for HDR content. Option settings, we've already had a brief look here. These settings here are grayed out using game mode, so you don't have to worry about them with HDR. The HDMI content type though, you want to make sure that these are turned off. If you have it on the auto setting, the TV may do some sort of extra processing steps which will change the images, so they're not necessarily the most accurate. So to avoid that, turn that off and you'll basically get a more accurate picture. The HDMI RGB range, so again this relates to the HDMI RGB level on your consoles or Blu-ray player. We've got this set to normal because we're feeding it a limited range signal. If you're going to feed it a full range signal, then you should select the full option. Ideally, I'd probably suggest leaving it to limited. That way you don't have to change settings between playing games and viewing movies. And generally speaking, I think limited tends to be more accurate. There's less chance of mistakes, but generally map this to whatever signal you are sending to your TV. Screen settings, again, most of these are grayed out for HDR and game mode, but yeah, you want to make sure that overscan is turned off, and that's pretty much it. You don't really have to worry. Make sure you turn it off before you enter HDR, I guess. I would suggest to make sure you don't get any additional scaling. 3D settings we didn't actually touch as we don't have the 3D glasses, but these are the sort of default settings here if you do have 3D. They're not applicable for HDR or UHD. There's no 3D standards. It's only for 1080p anyway, so you don't have to worry about that for UHD content. Okay, so there you go, the best picture settings for the Panasonic DX750 for high dynamic range gaming. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of these adjustments will actually work across the entire sort of Panasonic 2016 range. So if you've got a higher end model or even a lower end set, then feel free to try these. And the majority of these adjustments will get you a much better, more accurate picture than the sort of out-the-box defaults, which is normally like dynamic or normal mode. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, as usual, don't forget to like or subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.